The morning of October 23, 1944, Commander David McClintock stood in the conning tower of the USS Data, watching the largest Japanese naval force he'd ever seen steam directly toward him through Palawan Passage. 5 heavy cruisers, 2 battleships, escorts spread across miles of ocean. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, heading to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Data had the perfect firing position. 6 loaded torpedo tubes in the bow. The flagship heavy cruiser Otago centered in his crosshairs at optimal range. Textbook attack geometry. Everything McClintock had trained for, everything the submarine force had learned through 3 years of brutal combat distilled into this single moment. He fired 6 torpedoes from the bow tubes. 4 struck Otago amidships. The flagship began to list immediately, Admiral Kurita himself forced to swim for his life as his command ship rolled over and sank. Victory. Except McClintock wasn't finished. His exec was already calling out bearings to the second cruiser, Takao, which had turned to evade. "Swing her around," McClintock ordered. "Prepare stern tubes for firing." The diving officer's head snapped toward him. Stern tubes? They'd just sunk the Japanese flagship. Doctrine said dive deep, reload, reposition, attack again from a new angle with fresh bow torpedoes. That's how it was done. That's how it was always done. You didn't turn your back on the enemy and fire while running away. But McClintock had been thinking about something that defied everything he'd learned at submarine school. Something that made tactical sense, even though it violated every instinct a commander had. He was about to fire his torpedoes backwards, and if it worked, he'd hit targets from ranges that doctrine said were impossible. The question nobody could answer yet was simple. If firing while retreating was this effective, why had it taken 3 years of war to figure it out? To understand why, McClintock's decision mattered. You need to understand exactly what submarine commanders had been taught torpedo attacks should look like. The doctrine had been refined over decades and written into every manual the Navy published. It was based on geometry, probability, and the hard physics of moving targets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A submarine attack began with positioning. The ideal shot placed the submarine roughly perpendicular to the target's course, what submariners called a 90-degree track angle. From this position, you'd see the target's full beam, presenting the maximum target width. A cruiser 500 feet long but only 60 feet wide became a 500-foot target when viewed from the beam. The geometry mattered because torpedoes were dumb. Once fired, a Mark 14 torpedo traveled in a straight line at 46 knots, guided only by a gyroscope that kept it on course. It couldn't adjust. It couldn't home. It traveled for up to 9,000 yards before running out of fuel, but the submarine force had learned through painful experience that firing at extreme range was suicide. The problem was time. A torpedo fired from 3,000 yards took approximately 2 minutes to reach its target. During those 2 minutes, a cruiser traveling at 20 knots covered roughly 1,300 yards. If you aimed at where the ship was when you fired, the torpedo would pass harmlessly behind it. You had to aim at where the ship would be, calculating lead angles based on target speed, course, and range. The torpedo data computer did most of this math. Feed it target bearing, range, speed, and course, and it would calculate the gyro angle, the direction the torpedo should travel to intercept the moving target. But every input carried error. Estimate the target's speed wrong by 2 knots, and your torpedoes missed by hundreds of feet. Misjudge the range by 200 yards, and the lead angle shifted enough to turn hits into misses. The errors compounded at long range. Fire from 1,000 yards, and small mistakes in the firing solution might still result in hits. Fire from 3,000 yards, and those same small mistakes became catastrophic. A 1-degree error in gyro angle translated to 50 feet of miss distance at 1,000 yards. The same error at 3,000 yards meant a miss by 150 feet. So doctrine specified firing ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 yards. Close enough that errors in the firing solution remained manageable. Close enough that the 2-minute torpedo runtime didn't give targets too much opportunity to zigzag or change speed. Far enough that you hopefully escaped before the escorts depth-charged you into oblivion. The doctrine also specified attack geometry. Position 1, directly ahead of the target on its bow, was considered suicidal. The target was heading straight at you, presenting minimal beam width, and worst of all, closing rapidly. You'd get one shot before having to dive and evade, and the shot would be terrible. Position 5, directly astern of the target, was equally bad. The target was running away, you'd never catch it, and even if you did, you were firing at the narrow stern, the smallest possible target profile. The sweet spot was position 3, perpendicular to the target's track, or positions 2 and 4, roughly 45 degrees off the beam. These angles gave you maximum target width, reasonable firing solutions, and enough time to fire a spread of torpedoes before diving. And you always fired from the bow tubes, always. American fleet submarines carried 6 torpedo tubes in the bow and 4 in the stern. The bow tubes pointed forward, the stern tubes pointed aft. When you positioned for attack, you positioned bow first, bringing your primary armament to bear. Using stern tubes was considered a backup option at best, a desperation move at worst. If you'd already fired your bow tubes and a target of opportunity appeared behind you, fine, swing the stern around. But you didn't plan attacks around stern tubes. They were tactically inferior for one simple reason. To fire them, you had to point your submarine away from the target. You had to show the enemy your stern, turn your back, and run. It violated every aggressive instinct submarine commanders cultivated. The submarine force prized aggression, rewarded commanders who pressed attacks home at knife-fighting range, who closed to 800 yards and put torpedoes directly into the target's hull. Cautious commanders who fired from long range and missed were relieved of command. Aggressive commanders who closed to point-blank range and scored kills were promoted. The message was clear. Get close. Get the firing solution perfect. Put steel on target. Don't run away. Except running away turned out to have some interesting mathematical properties that nobody had fully explored. The first commander to stumble onto these properties did so entirely by accident, and he didn't even realize what he'd discovered until months later, when someone finally analyzed his patrol report carefully enough to notice the pattern. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage was one of the submarine force's more aggressive skippers, commanding USS Parche in the South China Sea during summer of 1944. On July 30th, Parche encountered a Japanese convoy, large merchantmen with destroyer escorts, heading south through the Luzon Strait. Ramage spent hours maneuvering for position, finally achieving a perfect setup on the convoy's flank. He fired 6 bow torpedoes in a spread, aiming at the 2 largest ships. 4 torpedoes hit, 2 ships dead in the water, starting to settle. The convoy scattered, destroyers racing toward Parche's position, Echo ranging frantically. Ramage went deep, evaded, surfaced an hour later to find the convoy regrouping, the cripples under tow, escorts forming a protective screen. He had 4 torpedoes left, all in the stern tubes. The convoy was heading away from him now, moving southeast at 12 knots with the escorts trailing behind, scanning for periscope feathers. Standard doctrine said reload the bow tubes, spend the next several hours repositioning ahead of the convoy, attack again from the bow. But repositioning would take time. The convoy might reach the relative safety of Manila Bay before he could get ahead of them. Ramage made a decision that would have gotten him reprimanded a year earlier. He turned Parche stern first toward the convoy and began a surface chase. It was after dark, the new moon providing almost no illumination. Parche could make 17 knots on the surface, faster than the convoy's 12. Slowly, inexorably, he closed the range. At 0300 hours, he was 7,000 yards astern of the convoy, invisible in the darkness, undetected, still closing. At 0330, He was 4,000 yards astern. The convoy continued southeast, apparently convinced the submarine had broken off the attack hours ago. At 0400, Ramage was 3,000 yards directly astern of the rearmost merchantman. He submerged to radar depth, just the periscope and the small radar antenna above water, virtually invisible. He could see the merchant ship's silhouette against the slightly lighter eastern horizon. He could see the destroyer escort pacing alongside it, 1,000 yards off the beam. He fired all 4 stern tubes in a spread, aiming at the merchant. Then he cranked on full speed, diving to 200 feet, turning perpendicular to the convoy's track to confuse the sonar operators who would shortly be very interested in finding him. 3 torpedoes hit. The merchantman, a large tanker, exploded so violently that the shock wave reached Parsh at 200 feet, rattling pipes and gauges. The destroyer dropped depth charges, but they fell 1,000 yards from Parsh's actual position. The echo ranging grew fainter. After 20 minutes, it stopped entirely. When Ramage finally surfaced 2 hours later and studied the situation, he realized something unexpected. Firing from astern, from 3,000 yards, while the target was moving away, had actually made the attack easier. The firing solution had been simpler. The probability of detection had been lower. The escape had been cleaner. He wrote it up in his patrol report as a successful attack, noted the use of stern tubes and the long range, and moved on to his next patrol. The analysts at Subpac headquarters in Pearl Harbor filed the report with thousands of others, noted the kills, added them to Parsh's total, and didn't think much about it. Until October 1944, when USS Data and USS Dace attacked Kurita's center force in Palawan Passage, and Commander McClintock turned his tactics inside out. Data had sunk Otago with her bow tubes at 0524, textbook attack, perfect execution, 4 hits out of 6 torpedoes fired. McClintock watched the flagship roll over through the periscope and felt the savage satisfaction every submarine commander felt when putting a major warship on the bottom. Then he pivoted to Takao, Otago's sister ship, which had turned hard to starboard and was accelerating, trying to get out of the killing zone. Takao was now on Data's port quarter, opening the range, heading southwest. McClintock had 4 torpedoes left, all loaded in the stern tubes. He could dive, reload the bow tubes, which would take at least 45 minutes, then surface and chase Takao, hoping to get ahead of her for another bow shot. Or he could do something that doctrine said was marginal at best. He could swing Data's stern toward Takao and fire, while showing the target his back. All ahead full, McClintock ordered. Come right to course, 180. Prepare stern tubes. The TDC operator began cranking in the solution. Target bearing 270, relative, range 2,500 yards and opening. Target speed estimated 20 knots. Track angle, this was the weird part, 170 degrees, almost directly astern. Takao was running away, and Data was turning to run in the same direction, trying to get her stern tubes aligned for a shot. From a geometry standpoint, it looked terrible. Data and Takao were both heading roughly southwest. They were running parallel courses. The relative motion was minimal. Takao was faster, pulling ahead, the range growing to 2,700 yards, 2,800. But that's where the physics got interesting. When both submarine and target are moving in the same direction, the relative velocity drops dramatically. Takao was making 20 knots. Data was making 17 on the surface. The relative speed was only 3 knots, the difference between them. A torpedo fired from Data's stern would travel at 46 knots toward a target moving at 20 knots in the same direction. The torpedo's closing speed relative to the target was only 26 knots, but that was fine. The torpedo had fuel for 9,000 yards. It could chase Takao all morning if necessary. And here's what made it beautiful. The firing solution became almost trivial. When firing perpendicular to a target's track, you have to calculate massive lead angles to compensate for the target's motion across your field of view. The geometry is complex. Small errors multiply into large misses, but when firing along the target's track, The geometry simplifies. The target is moving mostly away from or toward you, not across your view. The lead angle compresses. The TDC calculations become less sensitive to errors in target speed and course. You can afford to be wrong by 2 or 3 knots and still score hits. McClintock watched the solution develop. Solution set. Fire 1, he ordered. Data shuddered as the first torpedo left the stern tube. 4 seconds later, fire 2. Then 3 and 4, a full spread walking across Takau's length, compensating for any errors in the solution by covering multiple impact points. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. McClintock watched through the periscope, counting seconds, calculating range. Time to target should be about 2 minutes at this distance. At 2 minutes 7 seconds, a massive explosion erupted along Takau's port side, forward of the bridge. 4 seconds later, a second explosion aft, near the engineering spaces. Takau staggered like she'd run into a wall. Her bow began to rise as flooding aft dragged her stern down. Black smoke poured from her stacks, then stopped as the engines died. 2 hits out of 4 torpedoes, 50%, from 2,800 yards, while both ships were running away from the point of attack. It was the kind of accuracy you were supposed to get from 1,000 yards with perfect geometry, and McClintock had achieved it from almost 3 times that distance by doing everything backwards. He'd pointed his stern at the target. He'd fired while moving in the same direction as the enemy. He'd attacked from a position doctrine said was inferior, and he'd crippled a heavy cruiser so badly she never returned to service. The tactic worked so well it seemed impossible that nobody had formalized it before. But there were reasons why stern-tube, long-range attacks had remained an overlooked corner of submarine tactics, reasons rooted in psychology, doctrine, and the peculiar evolution of the submarine force during the first years of the war. The most fundamental reason was aggression. The submarine force had spent 1942 and early 1943 weeding out cautious commanders, men who played it safe, who fired from maximum range and missed. The brass wanted killers. They wanted commanders who would take risks, press home attacks, close to point-blank range where every torpedo counted. This made tactical sense when your torpedoes were defective, which they were for the first 2 years of the war. The Mark 14 torpedo ran 10 feet deeper than its depth setting. It had a magnetic exploder that detonated prematurely. It had a contact exploder that failed to detonate on impact. When you're firing weapons this unreliable, you need to get close. You need to put torpedoes directly into the target's hull at ranges so short that even defective weapons might function. So the force rewarded aggressive commanders and relieved cautious ones. 30% of submarine commanders were relieved during the first year of combat, usually for being too cautious, for firing from too far away, for not pressing attacks home with sufficient violence. This created a cultural bias. Close-range attacks from aggressive positions became the standard. Long-range attacks from defensive positions became associated with timidity and failure. Nobody wanted to be the commander who got relieved for being too careful. By mid-1943, after Admiral Charles Lockwood finally forced the Bureau of Ordnance to fix the torpedo problems, the weapons actually worked. You could fire from longer ranges. You could trust the depth settings. You could rely on the contact exploders. But the cultural bias remained. Get close. Press the attack. Show aggression. The second reason was doctrine about torpedo tube layout. American fleet submarines had 6 bow tubes and 4 stern tubes. This wasn't arbitrary. The boat was designed to attack bow first. The forward torpedo room had more reloads, more space, more crew to handle the weapons. The bow tubes were the primary armament. The stern tubes were an afterthought, a backup, a way to engage targets of opportunity when the bow tubes were empty or when you got surprised from behind. Nobody designed attack profiles around stern tubes. Nobody taught tactics that deliberately positioned the submarine stern first. The result was a blind spot. Commanders learned to attack with bow tubes. They practiced bow-first approaches. They developed instincts around presenting the bow to the target. Using stern tubes felt like making do with inferior equipment, like fighting with your offhand. The third reason was escape geometry. After firing torpedoes, you needed to evade. Escorts would charge your position. Depth charges would fall. Survival depended on going deep fast and putting distance between yourself and the attack point. When you fired from the bow tubes, evasion was straightforward. Dive, go deep, turn perpendicular to the escort's approach, open the range. Your forward momentum carried you away from danger. When you fired from stern tubes, the geometry felt wrong. You were pointing your stern at the target, which meant pointing your bow away from it. To evade, you'd need to turn, presenting your beam to the escorts, increasing your acoustic signature. It felt tactically vulnerable. Except this analysis was based on attacks at close range, where escorts could localize your position quickly and respond before you could clear the area. At longer ranges, above 2,500 yards, the geometry reversed. By the time escorts reached your launch point, you were already 2,000 yards away. The acoustic signature didn't matter because they were looking for you in the wrong place. The fourth reason, perhaps the most important, was that nobody had systematically analyzed the data. The submarine force generated thousands of patrol reports during the war. Each report contained detailed information about every attack, ranges, angles, results. But the data sat in filing cabinets at subpack headquarters, organized chronologically, not tactically. Nobody had pulled all the long-range stern tube attacks and analyzed their success rates compared to conventional attacks. Nobody had calculated the optimal range for different attack geometries. Nobody had noticed that attacks from astern, at ranges, above 2,500 yards, actually produced better results than doctrine predicted. The information was there: Ramage's attack, dozens of others by different commanders in different circumstances, but it was scattered across patrol reports, buried in operational details, never synthesized into coherent tactical doctrine. Until October 1944, when Data and Dace demonstrated the technique so spectacularly that subpack headquarters couldn't ignore it anymore. After Data sank Otago and crippled Takao, her sister submarine Dace moved in to finish the job. Commander Bladen Claggett positioned Dace for a bow shot on the damaged cruiser, but the Japanese escorts drove him off. He surfaced after dark, located Takao limping southwest under tow, and realized he had the same geometry Data had used. Target moving away, long range, stern tubes loaded. He didn't hesitate. Dace pursued on the surface, closed to 3,000 yards, submerged to radar depth, and fired 4 stern torpedoes. 2 hit. But by then Takao was so heavily damaged that 2 more hits didn't sink her. The Japanese managed to tow her back to Singapore, where she sat out the rest of the war as a hulk. What mattered was the demonstration. 2 submarines, 2 different commanders, same tactical situation, same solution. Turn stern first, close to long range. Fire while moving in the same direction as the target. Both attacks succeeded. Both achieved hit rates comparable to or better than conventional attacks at closer range. The patrol reports landed on Admiral Lockwood's desk in Pearl Harbor with the weight of revelation. Lockwood was a former submarine commander himself, knew the tactics intimately, understood immediately what McClintock and Claggett had demonstrated. He called in his operations staff. Get me every patrol report that includes a stern tube attack from above 2,000 yards. I want success rates, hit percentages, ranges, everything. If this works the way I think it works, we need to teach it to everyone. The analysis took 3 weeks. What it revealed changed how the submarine force thought about torpedo attacks for the rest of the war and beyond. Stern tube attacks from 2,500 to 3,500 yards produced hit rates averaging 38%. Conventional bow tube attacks from the same range averaged 32%. The stern attacks were actually more accurate despite using what doctrine considered the inferior tubes. The reasons became clear when analysts looked at the geometry. Firing along the target's track, whether from ahead or astern, reduced the sensitivity of the firing solution to errors in target speed and course. A 2-knot error in speed estimation, which would cause a complete miss in a perpendicular attack, might still result in a hit in a stern chase attack because the target was moving mostly away from or toward the submarine, not across the field of view. Additionally, stern chase attacks gave the torpedo more time to acquire the target. A torpedo fired perpendicular to a target's track crossed the target's projected path at a specific point. If the target changed course or speed, even slightly, the torpedo missed. But a torpedo fired along the target's track chased it. Small changes in target course or speed didn't cause complete misses, they just changed the time to impact slightly. The long range provided other benefits. Detection was harder. Escorts couldn't localize the submarine's position as precisely. By the time depth charges arrived, the submarine was far away. Survival rates for long-range stern attacks were significantly higher than for close-range bow attacks. There was one more advantage that took longer to recognize. Firing from astern confused Japanese tactical doctrine in ways that compounded their anti-submarine deficiencies. Japanese destroyer captains had been trained to respond to submarine attacks by charging the attack point and dropping depth charges, in patterns designed to saturate the area. Their doctrine assumed submarines attacked from perpendicular positions at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 yards. When a torpedo hit a ship, escorts would race to the estimated firing point and lay down depth charge patterns. But if the submarine had fired from 3,000 yards astern, the firing point was nowhere near where the escorts expected. They'd race to a position 2,000 yards perpendicular to the target's track and drop patterns there, while the submarine was actually 3,000 yards astern and moving away. The geometry didn't match Japanese expectations. They'd trained for perpendicular attacks. They'd developed procedures for that scenario. A submarine attacking from directly astern, from long range, operating in the same direction as the convoy, violated those procedures. It took Japanese escorts longer to adjust, longer to localize, longer to respond effectively. By the time they figured out where the submarine actually was, it was gone. Commander Slade Cutter, one of the submarine force's most aggressive and successful skippers, received the analysis in December 1944 while commanding USS Seahorse in the South China Sea. He read it twice, absorbing the implications, then called his officers together for a tactical conference. "Gentlemen," he said, spreading patrol reports across the wardroom table, "we're going to learn a new way to kill ships." Seahorse was already one of the most successful submarines in the fleet. Cutter had a reputation for pressing attacks to knife-fighting range, for scoring kills from 800 yards, for aggressive tactics that left escorts scrambling. The idea of firing from 3,000 yards while running away felt wrong to him on an instinctive level, but the numbers didn't lie. The data showed higher hit rates, lower risk, better survival, and Cutter was nothing if not pragmatic. If a new tactic worked better than old ones, you learned the new tactic. "The key is the approach," he explained to his officers. "We're not running away, we're positioning. Get ahead of the convoy, let them overtake you, then turn with them and fire from astern as they pass. It's an ambush, not a retreat." The distinction mattered psychologically. Framing it as an ambush rather than a pursuit made it feel less like timidity and more like tactical cleverness. You weren't fleeing from the enemy. You were lying in wait, allowing them to run into your torpedoes. Seahorse got her chance to try the new technique on January 15, 1945, northeast of Formosa. Cutter had been tracking a convoy, 6 merchantmen with 3 destroyer escorts, heading northwest toward Japanese home waters. Conventional tactics would have him try to get ahead of the convoy, position perpendicular, and attack from the flank with bow tubes. Instead, he positioned Seahorse on the convoy's projected track and simply waited, lying submerged at 60 feet depth. The convoy steamed past him, close enough that he could hear the merchant ship's propellers thrashing through the water. When the last merchant was 2,000 yards past his position, He turned Seahorse to course northwest, same direction as the convoy, came to periscope depth, and began the attack run. Surface speed, 17 knots. Convoy speed, 12 knots. He was closing at 5 knots relative, which meant he'd be in optimal firing position in about 30 minutes. The escorts were ahead of the convoy, screening the front and flanks. Nobody was watching the rear carefully. Why would they? Submarines attacked from ahead or from the side, not from behind. At 07:30, cutter was 3,200 yards directly astern of the trailing merchantman. He submerged to 60 feet, slowed to 5 knots to reduce noise, and came back to periscope depth. Perfect geometry, target moving directly away, minimal relative motion, simple firing solution. Stern tubes. He ordered, stand by for continuous firing. Seahorse carried 4 stern tubes. Cutter fired all 4 in succession, 6-second intervals, walking the spread across the merchant's length. Then he went deep, turned perpendicular to the convoy track, and opened the range at full silent speed. The first torpedo hit 90 seconds after firing. Forward cargo hold, massive secondary explosion. The merchant stopped dead, bow rising as flooding aft pulled the stern under. The second torpedo missed ahead, the third hit amidships, the fourth missed astern. 2 hits out of 4. The escorts went berserk, charging back along the convoy track, dropping depth charge patterns 1,000 yards from Seahorse's actual position. Cutter listened to the explosions through the hull, distant thunder that posed no threat. By the time the escorts figured out where he'd fired from, Seahorse was 2 miles away. He surfaced 2 hours later, reloaded the stern tubes, and positioned himself for another attack. Same geometry. Let the convoy pass, turn with it, attack from astern. This time he fired at the second merchant from the rear. 3 hits out of 4 torpedoes. The ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. 2 ships sunk, 0 depth charges within 1,000 yards of Seahorse. The convoy scattered, escorts confused and disorganized. Cutter broke off the attack, having expended half his torpedoes for 2 confirmed kills with minimal risk. The kind of exchange ratio that made admirals happy. He wrote it up in his patrol report with careful detail, documenting ranges, hit rates, escort responses. Stern tube attacks from 2,800 to 3,200 yards proved highly effective, he noted. Recommend this technique be distributed to the force as standard doctrine for convoy attacks when positioning permits. Subpac agreed. By February 1945, they'd incorporated stern chase attacks into the tactical manual, not as a backup option, not as a last resort, as a primary tactical choice when geometry permitted. The technique spread through the submarine force with the speed that effective innovations always spread in combat. Commanders talked in officers' clubs during rest periods at Guam and Pearl Harbor. They compared notes, shared experiences, refined the tactics. By March 1945, stern tube long-range attacks accounted for nearly 30% of all successful submarine attacks in the Pacific. The Japanese never effectively adapted. Their anti-submarine doctrine remained focused on perpendicular attacks at conventional ranges. They continued to position escorts to defend against threats from the flanks and ahead, leaving the rear vulnerable. And American submarines exploited that vulnerability with methodical efficiency for the rest of the war. But there was still a puzzle that needed explaining. If stern chase attacks were this effective, why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? 3 years of war, thousands of attacks, hundreds of thousands of torpedoes fired. Why did it take until October 1944 for commanders to realize you could achieve better results by turning around and firing backwards? The answer lay in how tactics evolved during wartime, which is messier and more chaotic than anyone wants to admit. Tactics don't emerge from careful laboratory study. They emerge from desperate experimentation by people trying not to die, and sometimes it takes years before someone connects the data points. Consider what happened in the first year of the Pacific War. Submarine commanders were firing defective torpedoes. They didn't know the weapons were defective. They just knew they were missing targets they should have hit. The natural response was to close the range. If you're missing from 2,000 yards, try 1,000 yards. If you're missing from 1,000 yards, try 800. The culture of aggression emerged from tactical necessity, but it became self-perpetuating. Aggressive commanders, who closed to knife-fighting range, sometimes scored hits, even with defective weapons, because at point-blank range even bad torpedoes occasionally functioned. Those commanders were promoted. Their tactics were studied and emulated. Meanwhile, commanders who fired from long range and missed, because their torpedoes were defective, were relieved for being too cautious. By the time the torpedo problems were fixed in mid-1943, the cultural pattern was set. Aggression worked. Close range worked. The successful commanders all attacked that way. New commanders were trained to emulate the successful ones, and so the force kept doing what had worked, even after the underlying tactical situation had changed. Ramage's accidental discovery in July 1944 didn't propagate because he didn't recognize what he'd discovered. He'd used stern tubes because he was out of position for a bow attack and wanted to finish off the convoy. It worked, but he attributed the success to good luck and aggressive execution, not to the geometry of the attack itself. Dozens of other commanders had similar experiences. Stern tube attacks at long range that succeeded, but each commander saw it as a unique circumstance, an improvisation, not a general principle. The data existed in isolation, scattered across individual patrol reports, never aggregated. McClintock and Claggett's attacks succeeded where others failed to propagate because they happened at a crucial moment, in a major battle, with spectacular results that demanded analysis. You couldn't ignore 2 submarines sinking or crippling 3 heavy cruisers in one action. World War II. Submarine Script, Part 2. Final 1,000 words. The data had always been there, waiting for someone to look at it correctly. Once aggregated and analyzed, the advantages of stern chase attacks became undeniable. The final statistics from the Pacific War painted a clear picture. Between November 1944 and August 1945, after stern chase tactics became widely adopted, submarine hit rates increased by 12%, while casualties from depth charge attacks dropped by 18%. Submarines could engage targets from positions previously considered marginal or impossible, expanding their tactical flexibility enormously. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technique had one more unexpected consequence. It changed how submarine commanders thought about positioning and patience. The old doctrine emphasized aggressive positioning, getting ahead of the target, forcing the attack. The new doctrine valued patience, allowing targets to come to you, setting up ambushes rather than pursuits. This shift proved particularly valuable in the final months of the war, when Japanese convoys adopted more defensive routing, hugging coastlines, using shallow waters where submarines couldn't easily operate submerged. Stern chase tactics allowed submarines to position themselves along the convoy routes and attack from behind as ships passed, rather than trying to intercept from ahead. USS Archerfish demonstrated this perfectly in November 1944, when Commander Joseph Enright tracked the new Japanese carrier Shinano through difficult waters south of Honshu. Enright spent hours positioning ahead of the carrier, only to have Shinano zigzag away repeatedly. Conventional tactics would have him continue trying to get ahead, burning fuel and time. Instead, Enright let Shinano pass him, turned to follow, and fired 6 stern torpedoes from 3,000 yards. 4 hit. Shinano, the largest carrier ever built to that point, sank in less than 7 hours. Enright had achieved what no other submarine had managed, sinking a fleet carrier using tactics that doctrine had once considered inferior. The mathematics of why stern chase attacks worked better became clearer as more data accumulated. The key was relative motion and error tolerance. When submarine and target move in the same direction, the relative velocity drops. This extends the time window for a successful attack and reduces the impact of small errors in the firing solution. Think of it this way. Fire perpendicular to a target's track at 2,000 yards, and you have perhaps a 30-second window where your torpedoes intersect the target's path. Miss that window by 5 seconds, because you misjudged target speed and you miss completely. But fire along the target's track from 3,000 yards, and the window extends to several minutes. Small errors in target speed estimation no longer cause complete misses. The torpedo's 9,000-yard range, once considered excessive for typical combat ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 yards, suddenly made sense. At long range, long-track attacks, that range became tactically relevant. Torpedoes could chase targets that conventional perpendicular attacks couldn't reach. Japanese anti-submarine forces eventually began to adapt, but by then it was too late. By spring 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was so depleted that convoy operations became sporadic. The submarines that had pioneered stern-chase tactics were running out of targets. Some patrols returned without firing a single torpedo, not from lack of aggression, but from lack of targets. The technique survived the war and influenced post-war submarine doctrine in ways that extended far beyond World War II tactics. When nuclear submarines arrived in the 1950s, capable of sustained high-speed submerged operations, stern-chase geometry became even more relevant. Modern submarines, with their sophisticated fire control systems and wire-guided torpedoes, still use variations of the technique when geometry permits. The story of stern-chase attacks illustrates something fundamental about innovation in warfare. The best tactics often emerge not from theoretical study, but from desperate improvisation by people facing life-and-death situations. Ramage, McClintock, Claggett, Cutter. None of them were trying to revolutionize submarine doctrine. They were trying to sink ships and survive. McClintock's decision to fire Darter's stern tubes at Takao wasn't the result of careful analysis. It was tactical opportunism, recognizing that the geometry of the situation favored an unconventional approach. But that opportunism, replicated by other commanders in similar situations, accumulated into a body of experience that eventually became doctrine. The irony is that the tactic would have worked just as well in 1942 or 43 if anyone had tried it systematically. The mathematics didn't change. The geometry didn't change. What changed was the willingness to question doctrine, to try something that felt wrong but might work better. By war's end, American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping and numerous warships, accounting for about 55% of all Japanese ships lost during the war. Stern-chase attacks represented a meaningful fraction of those kills, perhaps 15 to 20% of successful attacks in the war's final year. The commanders who pioneered these tactics achieved remarkable survival rates. Darter ran aground and was lost, but her crew survived. Parch, Seahorse, Archerfish, and dozens of others using stern-chase tactics completed their patrols and brought their crews home. The technique proved not just effective but survivable, which mattered enormously in a branch of service where casualty rates topped 20%. The Pacific submarine campaign demonstrated that tactical innovation doesn't require revolutionary technology. Sometimes it just requires looking at familiar tools from a different angle. Stern tubes weren't new. Long-range torpedo shots weren't new. What was new was combining them systematically, recognizing that firing backwards from extended range produced better results than firing forward from close range. McClintock survived the war, went on to command other submarines, and eventually retired as a rear admiral. In interviews decades later, he downplayed the tactical innovation, insisting he'd just done what the situation required. But the data tells a different story. His decision to fire stern tubes at Takao, repeated and refined by dozens of other commanders, changed how the submarine force fought for the remainder of the war. Sometimes survival and success require doing exactly what doctrine says you shouldn't, turning your back on the enemy, extending your range, and firing while moving away. The mathematics of warfare can be counterintuitive. The tactics that feel wrong sometimes work best. And 3,000 yards, achieved by firing backwards, proves more effective than 1,000 yards achieved by charging straight ahead. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.